WisconsinEye's Campaign 2022 programming is sponsored by Wisconsin Counties Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Hospital Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139. To support programs like this, please consider a tax-deductible donation at wiseye.org/donate or by texting WisEye to 44321.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm your host, Lisa Pugh. Long viewed as a swing district, Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District is getting national attention as we see a potential flip to Republican control in the House this November. So what is so unique about this district and this part of the state? And why are we getting this national attention? We are joined by 2 experts and residents of the Driftless area here today. Rusty Cunningham, former executive editor of the Chippewa Herald and the Crosse Tribune, and Dr. Anthony Chergosky, political science professor with UW-La Crosse. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First, when we talk about a swing district, is there a political science definition for what is a swing district?
Any district that has a legitimate opportunity of going to either party. And Lisa, what is so striking about the House of Representatives nowadays is the decline in swing districts. When we look at the redistricting process since the past census in 2020, we get redistricting after the census. The redistricting didn't really favor either party, but what we did see is a decline in competitive districts. That means Wisconsin's 3rd district is one of the few competitive districts remaining in the country.
Let's talk about the nature of the 3rd Congressional District. You've been a resident there and covered political news there for a long time, Mr. Cunningham. So it extends nearly the entire western side of the state of Wisconsin. Let's look at a map of the district here. It includes urban centers like Eau Claire, La Crosse, the Twin Cities suburbs, the state's 2nd largest district geographically. What else makes this particular district in Wisconsin unique?
Well, Lisa, first of all, you mentioned Driftless area, and that clearly is a unique part of our state, of our world. We also have a very neighborly district, so we're neighbors with Illinois, we're neighbors with Iowa, we're neighbors with Minnesota, as you said, all the way up to the Twin City exurbs. One of the things that's very interesting is the number of college campuses we have in our district, from River Falls and Stout and Eau Claire down to La Crosse and Platteville.
Six or 7 now.
It may be Barron County as well. So as you look at it, there are a lot of campuses, a lot of college students compared to other districts in the state. At one point, I think we had the most college students. So higher education, phenomenal health care with Mayo, Gunderson, Marshfield, and others. It's 13,500 square miles. You just referenced the map. It does cozy up to our neighbors in other states. And then all of a sudden it just goes over here to Stevens Point for whatever reason.
And all of that geography affects the politics?
Of course it does, and of course the campus at Stevens Point as well. So the district is 56.85% rural, 43.15% urban, median household income of nearly $60,000, and just a great place to live.
And, all of that does, like you say, affect the politics, makes it a little bit interesting for a candidate to run. You mentioned the redistricting process. There's been a lot of discussion in Wisconsin about potential gerrymandering, how those maps were drawn, how those districts are drawn. But wasn't this particular district drawn in some ways to favor Democrats at one point?
It was, Lisa, and Rusty mentioned how the district takes an odd turn into the Stevens Point area, and that was done following the 2010 census in order to shore this district up for Ron Kind, to make it more friendly terrain for the Democrats. But sometimes redistricting doesn't guarantee a particular outcome. And in this case, we have seen a drift towards more competitive district, a more evenly divided district, one that even went for Donald Trump twice when you look at the 2016 and 2020 elections. So it was drawn to help Ron Kind, the longtime incumbent member of Congress from this district. But it definitely seems to be going on the Republican side, the Republican direction over the last few years.
Yeah, it is interesting to look at the results of recent elections. We're going to show a slide of the presidential election results over the last few years in that area. In presidential elections from 2000 to 2012, Democrats were winning. In fact, President Obama won here by 17 points in 2008, and then again by more than 10 points in 2012. And then, as you mentioned, fast forward to 2016, and in 2020, you see Donald Trump winning here. So clearly is becoming certainly purple, if not even more leaning toward the red for a district in Wisconsin. The Cook Political Report has the district leaning Republican for November. What has changed in the district, would you say?
Well, I think national dynamics and rural advocacy, I think they're throughout the country, but certainly in the 3rd District. There are those, let's go back to the politics of resentment, written about the Walker administration and the UW-Madison professor who went throughout the state, and she went to rural coffee clutches and asked questions, and people just said, we're not represented, we're not being heard. So clearly, part of that dynamic is going on. When we talk, too, about gerrymandering and we talk about partisanship, know that Ron Kind was elected in 1996. Has been
26 years.
That's right. But before that, only 2 Democrats were elected from this area, going back to the turn of the century. And I'm talking about the other century, 20th century. So when you look at that, I think it tells you that the district for ages has skewed moderate Republican, and Kind is certainly more moderate. After the 2020 election, the 3rd District was only one of 7 that voted for Trump and voted for a Democratic representative.
Pretty remarkable.
It really is remarkable. So it shows a good deal of trust in Kind. It shows how Trump engaged rural as well as other voters, which I think is an important element to remember as we talk about this race upcoming. I just think as you look at the swing, you just talked about it, a couple counties in particular. Buffalo County, which is along the Mississippi, in 2012, Obama carried that by 3 percentage points, but Trump won it by 22 points in 2016.
Some narrower margins.
Absolutely.
There.
So really interesting to see the inroads, especially in rural areas.
We did learn just about a year ago that Congressman Kind was not going to run after. We talked about this 26 years in office, making this an open seat after being there for 13 years. Is an open seat generally in Congress more likely to flip parties?
Absolutely, Lisa. And that is because you don't have that incumbent there who has the established track record. Like Rusty said, Ron Kind had built up a reputation over the years, and that had helped him gain some of those key crossover votes from voters who would normally vote Republican in other races, but they looked at Ron Kind and they saw someone who was focused on local issues, someone who stayed out of the divisive culture wars in the country, and someone who had really distinguished himself from the National Democratic Party brand. So for years, Ron Kind was able to get a decent segment of voters who would typically go Republican, but were willing to go for Ron Kind because they saw him as a different kind of Democrat. Now you have no one in the race with that incumbency advantage, that incumbency reputation, and so we start with a clean slate, so to speak. Not quite a clean slate because Derek Van Orden, the Republican candidate, had run in 2020. So he's kind of continuing on with his 2020 campaign. Exactly, into the 2022 campaign. But it really is a reset for this district after a very long time when Ron Kind had been quite successful in the particular political dynamics of this region.
We mentioned at the top of the show, this race is getting some national attention. We hear Wisconsin talked a lot about in the national pundit world. Why are people paying attention to this race?
Well, I would argue that it's not just this race, but this has been going on for a long time. Look at the number of presidents who have come to La Crosse, Wisconsin to campaign. Bill Clinton, oh, by the way, when he was there, name Monica Lewinsky was just popping up on the psyche of America. We've had President Obama, Bush. We've had presidential visits or candidate visits that have, I think, shown that, yeah, this is a district that is fairly representative of urban, rural, fairly close from Republican and Democrat. Al Gore flew all night from his nomination speech at the Democratic National Convention to start his campaign on the Mississippi River in La Crosse, Wisconsin the next morning. So this has long been viewed as a district that is fairly centrist, fairly reasonable, fairly engaged, a good place to campaign, and people listen.
Well, not a bad part of the state either, right?
It's gorgeous.
And a good time of year to go there. We'll just make a plug for that area. La Crosse's WKBT in July reported that the National Journal had ranked the 3rd Congressional District as the most likely House seat to flip in November. Do you agree with that?
I agree with the general sentiment that this is likely, at least somewhat likely, to go to the Republican candidate in this particular election. I think it's a highly competitive election between Brad Pfaff, the Democrat, and Derek Van Orden, the Republican. I think Van Orden is the slight favorite at this point. And you look at the Trump vote. You look at how Donald Trump carried this district twice in 2016 and then again in 2020. And voters nowadays are just becoming a lot more predictable, Lisa. We have in western Wisconsin had that reputation for independence, for being a bit unpredictable, and for following the political winds rather than just voting the party line. But even in western Wisconsin, those national trends are catching up to us, where more and more voters just vote the party line. And if that continues into 2022, then the presidential results from 2016 and 2020 would tend to bode well for the Republican candidate Derek Van Orden. So this is absolutely at the top of the Republican Party's list. And it's a key race because they need to flip a certain number of districts to gain the House majority. They would like to gain a lot of districts in order to pad that majority if they do achieve majority status. This is one that's very much on the Republican Party's radar. You're seeing a lot of spending on the Republican side. You're seeing a lot of focus on the Republican side. They really want to flip this seat.
You mentioned this area as a centrist area. We've talked about Ron Kind as a moderate candidate. He's generally known as one of the most bipartisan members of Congress currently. And you mentioned he's one of just 30 House Democrats that came from a district that had voted for Donald Trump. But is a moderate a dying breed in Congress?
Well, let's hope not. It may be, but frankly, let's hope not. Let's hope we can have congressmen and congresswomen who we can all talk to and who will listen to all of us. One of the things as a journalist, when we endorse candidates, we always looked at how are these people when it comes to constituent services? Do they listen? Do they respond? Do they welcome people into their office and into the discussion regardless of what party or background, but do they understand that they're public servants and serving the needs of constituents regardless of party is terribly important. So politically, one would say, yeah, there aren't too many moderates left. But I hope we can not lose that spirit of serving voters, because that's what this should all be about.
What do you see as the trend for moderates in Congress?
They're greatly on the decline. We've seen an enormous increase in polarization in Congress. We've seen an enormous increase in the spirit of teamsmanship in Congress, Lisa. And that means that Democrats view themselves as a team, Republicans view themselves as a team. Part of this is the ideological polarization of the two parties. As they have divided, they become more insular, they become less likely to make deals across party lines. But that competition for majority status is the other piece of this. If the parties are constantly engaged in a battle for majority control, where's the room to negotiate? Where's the room to compromise if you're always focused on the competition for the next election? So as political scientists, we view the competition for majority control, the very intense competition, and the ideological polarization of the parties as two of the key factors that are driving the extinction of moderates in Congress and the rise of partisanship in Congress.
Voters in the 3rd Congressional District have two very divergent choices on the ballot in November. Let's talk about them. Republican candidate Derek Van Orden is a retired Navy SEAL endorsed by President Trump that we've mentioned. He ran against Ron Kind in 2020, losing to him by just under 10,000 votes, or 2%. Democrat Brad Pfaff is a current state senator and former state agriculture secretary who worked for Congressman Kind and in the Obama administration. What do you see as the biggest differences between these two candidates?
Well, I agree with Anthony talking about the polarization. I think as you look at these two candidates, they're pretty different. And in fact, we're having a heck of a time getting them in the same room to have a forum together. So I think clearly Van Orden has spent a lot of time on the road. This is his second campaign. His name is out there. He's starting to understand the district. But he's very much tapping into what I would call that Trump wave of rural independence, anger. I think he's tapped into that well. Brad Pfaff, on the other hand, as you mentioned, more of a political establishment figure, grew up on a farm, knows our part of the state very, very well, has long been respected for his service. So clearly they're very different.
Polls show Van Orden with the edge. Do you agree?
I do, Lisa, and that's because of the Trump edge in the district over the last two presidential elections. And I couldn't agree more with what Rusty said. Derek Van Orden is very much replicating what made Trump so popular in these rural parts of our district. This anger, this sense of grievance, this sense of being left behind, this sense of being not heard, this sense of being unhappy about the changes in the world and the changes in the nation. All of that mixed together, Derek Van Orden really seems to understand that in a way that Donald Trump also understood that. I view Derek Van Orden as someone who really follows in the footsteps of Donald Trump. And he is really capturing what made Donald Trump appealing to many parts of this district. I think that could pay off for him in this election.
That's interesting that you say that. Van Orden was at a rally with former President Donald Trump, spoke alongside him. He proudly features his endorsement by President Trump on his website. In some parts of the country, that endorsement is not necessarily an advantage. Is it an advantage in western Wisconsin?
Well, again, the fact that we are politically split means that with some of his supporters, it's a huge advantage. With others, they would bristle at that. So, as you know, in some parts of the country, they've not touted a Trump endorsement or asked him to come in. But in other parts, they embrace him and ask him to come in. So I think, again, it's great if he's endorsed you and you share the philosophy. And it's probably not so great if you think a return of that kind of leadership is a bad thing.
Let's talk a little bit about money. There's a lot of money in this race. Finance reports show that Derek Van Orden has more than 10 times the hand-on cash as Brad Pfaff, and in the last reporting period, he had raised more than $4.5 million. There's much more than being spent on third-party groups in this race. I'm sure you're seeing all sorts of ads on your televisions back home. To what degree does money factor into this race?
A big factor, and that is because this is an open seat with no incumbent. And political scientists have found that when you don't have an incumbent in the race, when you have two fresh new faces in the race, money really makes a difference because it gets your name out there, it gets your platform out there. And you're absolutely right about the enormous resource disadvantage that the Democrats and Brad Pfaff are at. And that is largely because Derek Van Orden has rolled over his campaign from 2020 straight into 2022.
He already had more money?
He already had more money. He had the email list. He had the fundraising connections ready to go for 2022. Plus, he's got that outside money because Republicans view this as such a key race in their broader quest to win the majority status in the House of Representatives. So it is just an enormous resource gap between the two sides.
Is that a sign that national Democrats have given up on this seat?
I wonder about that, Lisa. I do, because Brad Pfaff does not currently have the resources to seriously compete in this campaign when you look at the resources on the Republican side. I'm waiting for the Democratic resources, the outside money, to start to come in. It hasn't come in quite yet.
And the clock is ticking.
The clock is ticking. And that may tell us something about how state Democrats, national Democrats feel about this race.
What do you think about the money? This is a lot of money in that part of the state.
It is, and we see it, frankly, in legislative races, in statewide races.
Oh, it's not just this race.
Oh, no. The amount of money that we've seen in races in our area is just mind-boggling. And again, third party, clearly there's plenty of that. Now, let's not forget Brad Pfaff had a four-way primary. So, yes, he got a late start. And the funding, I would argue, would have come late, too, in part because of that. But we will see. Will that money be forthcoming? I know there have been some fundraisers in the district as well as outside trying to help Brad. But clearly, if this is the second time you've run, as with Van Orden, you've got a good head start.
Record setting?
I think it will be before it's all said and done.
Any estimates on how much money will be spent in this race?
Hard to say, Lisa, but no doubt it's going to be an eye-popping sum because you've got the outside money pouring in. You've got Van Orden, who has proven to be a very effective fundraiser. Democrats desperately trying to play catch-up. It all adds up to a very expensive race.
What issues are most important to voters in the western part of the state? Are there some issues that are really kind of being prioritized?
Well, that's two questions. One is what's important to the voters, excuse me, and the other is what's being prioritized
by the candidates.
But as you see in the district, as you see across the state, crime, are we safe here? Law and order sorts of meat and potatoes issues. Health care has been a huge, during the Affordable Care Act, that was a huge deal. You don't hear that as much right now because inflation, I would think it's the economy stupid mantra continues to work in our district. I think inflation, crime, public safety, I think, and again, this whole notion of am I being heard?
What about the issue of abortion? Is that being discussed in your part of the state as well?
It was Brad Pfaff's first general election ad where he featured the issue of abortion, and I think it's indicative of the broader Democratic Party sense that they have an opportunity here, that the Republican position, in their view, is out of step with public opinion, and that they can make some headway with some of these voters who are maybe on the fence, maybe not sure if they're going to vote, that they can use abortion to make up some lost ground in what they always assumed was going to be a challenging midterm election.
You mentioned the mix between rural and urban in the 3rd Congressional District. Does that play into the unique issues that are important to voters in that area as well?
I think it does. And remember, turnout is always a key component. Well, what's interesting is look at local school board and school referendum votes in our district, especially in the Driftless region.
There's a huge referendum on the ballot in La Crosse.
That's right. So what kind of a dynamic will those sorts of referendums play in turnout? Will that bring a lot of people who might be for Pfaff, for Van Orden? Remains to be seen. But I expect really good turnout for this midterm, in part because there are so many local school and public safety referendums going on throughout the district.
There's a lot of news about water quality in the western part of Wisconsin. Do people generally vote for a candidate based on those sorts of issues, environmental issues, water quality issues?
Certainly if it directly affects them, but I agree with Rusty that there are any number of factors that could drive turnout. The referendum issues in our district are just eye-popping. The amount of referenda that are on the ballot, the struggles that schools are having with their facilities, with funding. You've got the water quality issue. You've got the national factors. I mean, Derek Van Orden has really nationalized this race, Lisa. He doesn't focus on those local issues so much as he focuses on the national issues. His first campaign ads have been about Joe Biden and his opposition to Joe Biden and his opposition to Nancy Pelosi. So you've got the national motivating factors, plus you've got the local motivating factors. I agree with Rusty. It all adds up to really, really high turnout, most likely, in this election.
Another issue that's been making headlines in this race is the issue of debates. I know there's a long history in the 3rd Congressional District of hosting debates between all sorts of levels of candidates, but there's controversy this year as these two candidates trying to agree on a format for the debate. Can you give us an update on that? I know you're involved with coordinating that.
I am involved, and right now we're at a bit of a standstill when it comes to Mr. Van Orden and Mr. Paff. Mr. Paff made this a campaign issue because he wanted 3 debates to be held. And at UW-La Crosse, and with organizations like the La Crosse Tribune and lots of other media entities and community partners, it's been our tradition over many, 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 many years to host debates through UW-La Crosse and in partnership with the local La Crosse media and the local La Crosse community. It's a wonderful tradition. It's one that we take great pride in, and we're having a lot of trouble continuing that tradition with this particular race because...
Do you think it will happen?
I don't know, Lisa. I really hope it does. You know, Mr. Van Orden agreed to the typical format in 2020 where it's moderated by UW-La Crosse and then there's a panel of journalists from locally. That's our typical format. Mr. Van Orden agreed to it in 2020. He is not agreeing to that format now. Brad Paff is pushing for debates. I don't know how this is going to play out, but I'm hopeful that there will be something worked out.
Do you think there should be a debate?
Well, I absolutely think there should be. I can't stress enough that we've been doing this. I started the Tribune in 1997, and we've been doing these debates of congressional, state senate, state representative, state assembly races since then, and I think before that. A lot of areas don't, frankly, have media that partner, that get along. We have a great history of newspaper and radio and TV and public broadcasting, the university and others hosting these debates. I can never remember a time when someone said, gee, this wasn't fair and I'm not doing this. But in this case, let me just read to you. Derek Van Orden issued a statement, not talking to a reporter, but issued a statement. I challenge the media to provide a fair town hall style setting for a debate with Brad Paff. 75% of our district does not have a 4-year degree, and they deserve to ask the questions, not university professors or biased media. Well, as a journalist who has been involved in editorial endorsements, editorially endorsing Republicans as well as Democrats, I look at a statement like this and I just have to wonder, why won't he answer some questions?
What's in it for a candidate to agree? Is there more to lose to participate in a debate for a candidate that has a lead?
I think that's why Brad Paff wanted 3 debates, because he's at a tremendous resource disadvantage. He needs to make up ground. And so having 3 debates would clearly be in his interest. And we have had those political considerations baked in now to these negotiations and this back and forth surrounding the debates.
And does Derek Van Orden have something to lose?
He does, because he's the front runner. He can really lean on paid media, those television advertisements. And so I think that's one reason why he may be reluctant to debate. It does come at the expense of a very long tradition that we've had in La Crosse. So that's the sad part about this. But the political considerations are what they are.
As we've talked about, Ron Kind finishing out his 26th year, he holds an important post in the Ways and Means Committee that oversees Medicare, Social Security, and taxes. Does the 3rd Congressional District lose some influence as Ron Kind leaves office?
It's always an interesting question, because one side will say, well, there was a career politician, and another side will say, boy, we're losing a lot of connection here and a lot of clout. Kind was able to bring a lot of heavy hitters into our district and show them problems. Take them to a farm, take them to a water quality issue, take them to investment opportunities that the Fed could help with. I just think it's a sad day to lose someone who has those kinds of connections, because I think Kind has earned a great reputation. On the other hand, it does offer an opportunity for a fresh voice, whichever the 2 candidates gets in.
Well, we have come to the end of our time, which means it's the most important question. What are your predictions in this race?
I think Van Orden has the edge. I think it's going to be a close race, because of the resource disadvantage for the Democrats, the resource advantage for Van Orden, because of the rural element of the district that is really loyal to Trump and thus loyal to Van Orden, I think Van Orden's got the edge.
Prediction, how close will this be?
I think it's going to be a lot closer than people think. I think it is an independent-minded district. We have a track record of being more moderate. And with that in mind, I think this could be a very close race.
Well, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers of Newsmakers. Be sure to tune in again as we sit down with the decision makers and highlight the issues that make a difference for all of us.
This program is a production of WisconsinEye, an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media network with a mission to inform, educate, and engage the citizens of Wisconsin. WisconsinEye is the nation's first and only independently funded state civics broadcast network, providing gavel-to-gavel access to government proceedings and events at the state capitol.
WisconsinEye relies on contributions from you. Your tax-deductible investment in WisEye supports access to unfiltered, beginning-to-end coverage of campaign 2022 and state capitol proceedings, available to you 24/7. Help us reach our goal of raising $30,000 by making a tax-deductible donation at wiseye.org/donate or by texting WisEye to 44321. Thank you for your support.